Meet Jacob Portman. He was an average 15-year-old boy living in Florida. He had only one friend named Ricky, who had green hair and drove around in a beat-up, rusty old car. When Jacob was younger, his grandfather used to tell him fantastic stories of how he had escaped monsters and went to live with peculiar children in a special home on the coast of Wales. He showed Jacob a picture of a little girl who could levitate, a sister and brother who had incredible strength, and countless others I do not have time to mention. For a little kid who had never left Florida, this was all very amazing, and Jacob spent many hours pretending to explore. His faith in his grandfather's stories, however, ended one day in second grade when he was bullied for supposedly believing in fairy tales. After the bullying incident, Jacob's dad explained that his father's stories were actually exaggerated versions of the truth. The monsters that he had really fled from were the Nazis, and the peculiar children were actually Jewish. Feeling like he had been lied to, Jacob started to think that his grandfather's stories were just silly tales. But later on in life, Jacob would soon have a very different point of view. One day, while trying to quit his seemingly unquittable job at Smart Aid, Jacob got a call from his grandfather. His grandfather had said that it was very dangerous at his house and that monsters were after him. Jacob tried to reassure his grandfather that there was nothing wrong and that there were no monsters, but the phone went dead. Jacob then asked his only friend to drive him to his grandfather's house to see if he was okay. When Jacob arrived at his grandfather's house, he found that the tables and chairs were overturned and that there was a hole in the back door. When he investigated the forest behind his grandfather's home, he found his grandfather, half dead, with 3 large gashes in his torso. His grandfather's last words were, "Find the bird, in the loop, September 3rd, 1940. Find Emerson, the letter," and then he died. Then Jacob turned around and was stunned to see the exact same monster that his grandfather had described in all his stories. Soon after this, Jacob passed out. In the next few days, a lot of things happened to Jacob. He hired a psychiatrist named Dr. Golan to help him cope with his grandfather's death, and he explained to the police what he saw that night when his grandfather died, including the monster, which probably only succeeded in making them think he was insane. 9 months later, on Jacob's 16th birthday, his Aunt Susie gave him a book entitled The Selected Works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Jacob remembered his grandfather's last words, and as luck would have it, a letter tucked between the pages of the book fell to the ground. Jacob quickly scooped it up and ran away to read it. When he read it, he noticed that it was addressed to his grandfather, whose name was Abe, and that it was from someone named Headmistress Alma LaFay Peregrine. There was even a photograph of her. Jacob noticed that the address was from Wales, which is somewhere in the UK. He begged his parents to let him go. They eventually said yes, and soon Jacob and his dad were on their way to Cairnholm Island in Wales. Soon after they arrived, they discovered that they had to stay in a dingy little hotel room in a pub. Jacob's plan for the next morning was simple. He was going to go to the children's home, try to find out if anyone still lived there, and ask them questions. He promised his father that he would not go alone, but he did anyways. Jacob found a very old, bombed-out Victorian home. Inside the home, he found a locked chest that seemed to be brimming with secrets. In an attempt to open it, he dropped the chest from a great height, after which it broke through the floorboards and smashed open on the basement floor. Among the broken chest fragments were a bunch of photographs, like his grandfather's. All of a sudden, everything went dark. When he turned around, Jacob saw a girl holding a ball of pure fire in her hand. When rendered speechless and confused by this sight, Jacob barely uttered a word before she ran away. When the darkness cleared, Jacob decided to run after the girl. He recognized that this was one of the peculiar children in his grandfather's photos. He soon came to a bog and saw the girl on the other side of it entering a cave. By the time he was able to get to the other side of the bog and into the cave, the girl was gone. Thinking that he had made this all up in his head, Jacob left the cave and went back to town. He thought something seemed different on the walk back to the pub. When he tried to go to his room at the pub, a different bartender stopped him. Jacob explained that he was trying to go to his room, but then other people started saying that he was probably a Nazi spy. Jacob had no idea what was going on, but there was one thing that he knew he had to do: run as fast as he could. Jacob thought he was surely losing his mind. As he began to calm down, he felt somebody pull him to a nearby alley. When he turned to face his captor, he saw it was the girl he had been chasing. She held a knife to his throat, asked him who he was, and why he was chasing her. Jacob said his name and explained that he was Abe Portman's grandson, but the mention of Abe's name only made the girl more angry. Before she could do any harm to Jacob, they heard the angry pub patrons coming their way, and the girl brought Jacob to a nearby house. The girl looked out a window while Jacob looked around the vacant house. He saw a calendar on the wall and discovered that it was September 3rd, 1940, the exact date that his grandfather had said before he died. Then Jacob passed out. When he regained consciousness, Jacob found that his hands were tied up. The girl seemed to be having a conversation with a young man who Jacob could not see, although he could hear his voice clearly. Before Jacob could say anything, a glass of water floated towards him and placed itself in his hand. Jacob then realized that the voice belonged to an invisible boy. The girl and the invisible boy discussed how they could escape the house without being noticed by the angry pub mob. The invisible boy said that they could walk out of the house soon. Just then, a loud rumbling sound echoed from outside. As they stepped outside of the house, they all looked towards the sky to see a group of German fighter planes. The trio made their way towards a large old Victorian house, where Jacob was formally introduced to the headmistress, Miss Peregrine, who instructed Emma, Jacob's captor, to cut the ropes from his hands. Miss Peregrine explained to Jacob all essential information about peculiars, their origins, and the many different peculiarities that each of them possessed. She explained that as an Imbrine, her peculiarity enabled her to manipulate time as well as transform into a bird at will. All Imbrines, she explained, were charged with the responsibility to care for and protect peculiar children. Miss Peregrine invited Jacob to stay for supper and then introduced him to the other peculiar children who lived in the home. After dinner, they all gathered outside in the backyard to witness the changeover, an event at the end of a time loop, when time was reset to 24 hours prior. Miss Peregrine had explained that their changeover event occurred just before a German bomb landed on their beloved home in the early hours of September 4th, 1940. Thus, Miss Peregrine and her peculiar children had relived September 3rd, 1940, well over 20,000 times in the past 70 years. Over the next few days, Jacob continued to visit Miss Peregrine and her children in 1940. The portal of entry into their time loop was the cave he had first followed Emma into. One day, Jacob was wandering alone through Miss Peregrine's home when he entered a room and discovered the lifeless body of a boy named Victor. Jacob was informed by Emma that Victor had been killed by a Hollowgast, a creature that could only be seen by certain peculiars. Emma then told Jacob that his grandfather, Abe, had this peculiarity, and she strongly suspected that Jacob did as well. At that moment, Jacob recalled the monster that he saw the night his grandfather was killed, and was relieved to know that he was not insane at all. Miss Peregrine then explained to Jacob how Hollowgasts were once greedy peculiars who tried to find a way to exist as immortals outside of their time loops. These selfish peculiars conducted experiments with Imbrines, but their experiments resulted in them becoming primal Hollowgasts that no longer looked or acted like humans. But only a few peculiars, like Jacob and his grandfather, could actually see them. Meanwhile, Emma and the other peculiar children were tending to another Imbrine, named Miss Avset, whose time loop had been recently raided by the Whites. Whites were evolved Hollowgasts that had completely white eyes. They looked and acted like humans, but were much more violent. Jacob had remembered that a man from his time, in the present day, was found brutally murdered, but no one knew how the man died. Jacob thought of a plan to bring Enoch to the present day so that he could resurrect the murdered man using his peculiarity, and they could ask the man what had killed him. Against Miss Peregrine's implementation of a lockdown, Jacob, Emma, Enoch, and Bronwyn snuck out of the home and went to the present day. Enoch brought the murdered man to life, and Jacob asked the man what had happened before he was killed. The murdered man described a corpse-type thing with 3 large tentacles in its toothy mouth. Jacob knew immediately that a hollow had eaten the man. As the man's life slipped away, they heard someone enter the room. Jacob noticed right away who it was, Dr. Golan. Shortly after explaining that he was a white, Dr. Golan's pet Hollowgast entered the room. The 4 friends decided to split up so the hollow would have to choose, and Jacob managed to kill it with a pair of sheep shears. Shortly after arriving back at the home, Jacob found out that Golan had kidnapped Miss Peregrine and Miss Avset and brought them to a lighthouse. Jacob and Emma arrived there to find Golan holding a gun in one hand and a caged Miss Peregrine in the other. Jacob managed to knock the gun out of Golan's hand, but Miss Peregrine and her cage fell from the lighthouse to the water below. Golan kicked Jacob to the ground, only to be burned by Emma. Despite getting burned, Golan then tried to strangle Emma with his bare hands. Still on the floor, Jacob grabs the gun, aims, and pulls the trigger. Golan was finally dead. The next few scenes will be presented in stills so it is easier to follow. Emma and Jacob saved Miss Peregrine from the water, but were unable to find Miss Avocet. Also, Miss Peregrine couldn't turn human since she was injured. Because of this, the loop slipped, and the bomb that normally stopped ended up destroying their home. Jacob figured that the Peculiars needed him more than his family and left a note for his father on his bedside table. Then, the 10 peculiar children and 1 peculiar bird left in search of another Imbrine to help Miss Peregrine. Thanks for watching!